I'm honoured both personally and professionally to introduce an Irish non-governmental organisation representative, representative of Concern Worldwide, to brief us. Amina Abdulla is the Regional Director for the Horn of Africa of Concern Worldwide, and she's going to speak to us on the specific challenges facing the region. So Amina, thank you for staying up late, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Byrne Nason, for the invitation. Your Excellencies, my esteemed colleagues, I'm honored to be here today for this important conversation and commend Ireland for this initiative. By the time we finish with this discussion, more parents will be putting their children to sleep hungry or packing their belongings to move in search of food and safe shelter. Hunger and conflict are inextricably linked. This has been made clear by the unanimous adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2417 in 2018. Right now, there are over 821 million people facing crisis levels of food insecurity, a number that seems to be growing by the day. In the majority of these cases, conflict is the main driver of hunger. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is but one example of this link, given the impact it's had not only on Ukrainian families facing severe hardship, but also on the world's food supply chains and millions of people facing hunger around the world. This now global crisis has erupted over a matter of weeks. We are 56 days into the conflict, and the impact is being felt around the world. While this conflict would have been devastating in its own right, it comes on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, which already increased food prices, strained livelihoods, and eroded the resilience of the world's poorest people. For people living in conflict-affected areas, war and weapons are not only a threat to their livelihoods, to their lives, but to their livelihoods. Conflict destroys people's ability to provide for the most basic of needs, including food. It restricts movement and access to markets, farmlands, and employment. Conflict prevents people from accessing humanitarian assistance and denies humanitarian access to affected population. This denial is often deliberate with clear intent. Both conflict and hunger tend to exacerbate existing inequalities and create new and life-changing dangers, leaving women and girls particularly vulnerable, but shouldering the weight of keeping their children alive and safe, fewer resources and mechanisms to cope. For civilians, old and young, who are forcibly displaced, the decision to leave home often comes at a time when they've lost everything, completely stripped of their capacity to remain on their land and provide for themselves and their families. I think this is a terrible injustice. I oversee Concern's Horn of Africa region and have worked and lived across the countries in this region for most of my life. I'm experiencing firsthand how difficult it has become for humanitarian organizations to carry out our essential life-saving work in this region. Active conflict and the deliberate targeting of humanitarian workers restricts our movement and our ability to transport basic items to people who are left with nothing when conflict rips through communities. Both state and non-state actors deliberately deny humanitarian access and fail to provide conditions for civilians to safely access assistance. Sanctions and counterterrorism restrictions create complex administrative burdens and confer risks on aid organizations working in an already challenging context. Prices for fuel and food have soared, increasing our basic operating costs and increasing the value of the basic commodities we provide, which in turn increases the risks of violence targeted at aid workers. And at the same time, funding is becoming more difficult to secure as conflict-related and conflict-induced crises in the region continue without an end in sight. The cyclical nature of conflict in this region and the increasing need outstrips the investments of both humanitarian and development actors year on year. The interconnection of conflict, climate change, and hunger in the region has led to skyrocketing needs which can spiral out of control when humanitarian actors are unable to carry out their work. Currently, the region is facing one of its worst droughts in 4 decades, and an estimated 15 million people in the region are in need of emergency life-saving assistance, out of whom 600,000 are said to be facing famine-like conditions because we are unable to reach them with humanitarian assistance required. The role of the Security Council and regional actors such as the AU in holding state and non-state actors to account in facilitating humanitarian assistance and preventing needless deaths cannot be overstated. So one may ask, what must be done? I'd like to suggest 4 areas to explore as we seek to end the relentless cycle of conflict and hunger. First, it's important to note that sustainable solutions will require well-resourced, long-term principled cooperation between political and humanitarian actors. Humanitarian assistance is critical for saving lives in crisis, but its purpose is not to end crisis or build peace. We need political efforts that place affected civilians, their well-being and protection, and their right to a safe and prosperous future at the center of solutions, and strategically engage humanitarian actors to ensure the uninterrupted provision of assistance. As a first step, I think establishing a consistent early warning mechanism based on clear criteria is imperative for calling attention to situations of conflict-induced hunger and initiating collaboration between those involved in finding solutions. Second, I want to stress the importance of using all the tools at our disposal in addressing conflict and hunger. This includes engaging at local, national, and regional levels. I believe people in conflict are not passive victims, but peacemakers and peace builders, first-line responders, and negotiators. It is essential to create avenues for engaging communities, especially women, youth, and minorities, who tend to bear the burden of conflict and the impact of it. Concern's experience working in complex crisis over 50 years has shown that inclusivity ensures positive impacts are sustained over time. The Council must further strengthen its engagement with regional bodies who bring resources, knowledge, and a deep understanding of crisis contexts to peace building and mediation efforts. This is imperative. Third, there's need for Council members to work towards consensus on urgent humanitarian issues, including complex challenges around humanitarian access, sanctions, and counterterrorism. Humanitarian exceptions to sanction regimes have been successful in a variety of contexts, including Afghanistan and Somalia, and the Council should look towards a blanket application of such exceptions in order to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Finally, member states should continue raising issues of international humanitarian law and the impact of violations on food security. Your words and the discussions that take place in the Council matter. In an increasingly difficult operational environment, it is critical to constantly remind parties to conflict of their obligations to civilians and humanitarian actors, as well as to continue holding violators of IHL to account. As members of the Security Council, the very fact that you're meeting here today means that you recognize the complex linkages between conflict and hunger and are deeply concerned about the insurmountable harm that conflict-induced hunger inflicts on countries, communities, and families. Each one of you has a responsibility to every family around the world who at this moment cannot feed their children due to violent conflict. Every family around the world who at this moment is having to flee their home, leaving their lifetime behind. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to a constructive discussion.
Amina, thank you very much indeed, reminding us not just of our obligations, but our responsibility, and particularly, as you put it there poetically at the end, in relation to people putting their children to bed tonight in conflict situations who are hungry because of that instability. Thank you, Amina. So I wanted to thank all the briefers, really excellent messages to us this afternoon. They're going to remain on screen as long as they can to listen to the interventions from member states. If there are any technical issues or they have to disconnect, we have representatives of their organisations with us here in the room, so your messages will be clearly heard by the organisations and by our briefers. So thanks again to them. So with that, I'm moving now to listen to the views in the room, and we'll start with the members of the Security Council. I'm going to make some remarks in my own national capacity before moving to other speakers. So our briefers, I've just thanked you. You've left us in no doubt really about the scale of what we're facing by way of food insecurity across the globe. And I think it highlights again, not just to Council members, but to everyone in this House, the inextricable and I think insidious links between vulnerability, food insecurity and conflict. I'd like to say that hunger isn't an abstract idea in Ireland. Our own famine, which was 175 years ago, has left a remarkable echo, profoundly shaping our outlook and demographics to this day in Ireland. As a nation, we are repulsed at the notion of death through starvation. Our conviction, born of that lived experience, is that in a world of plenty, there can be no excuse for famine today. Yet, in spite of international commitments, many international commitments to eliminate hunger, we hear that hunger is rising at an alarming rate. Increasingly, as we've just heard from our briefers, conflict is a major cause of rising hunger levels. And colleagues, as we look across the agenda of the Security Council we're proud to sit on, the spectre of conflict and hunger looms really large. However, I have to say, the frequency with which the Council addresses it belies the severity of the threat it poses to food systems and, importantly, the threat it poses to people's lives. As we've heard today, more than 139 million people, huge number, are suffering the consequences of conflict-induced hunger. In Yemen, the scale and duration of the conflict has entirely eroded the country's ability to produce desperately needed food. Persistent conflict in Ethiopia has been a significant factor in driving to alarming rates millions of people into emergency levels of food insecurity. As Somalia's conflict cycle becomes more entrenched, over half of the population face severe hunger. Insecurity caused by armed gang conflict in Haiti has had a detrimental impact on an already fragile and fractured food system. We know that more than half of the population of Syria are food insecure following a decade of conflict. So, to put it simply, conflict-induced food insecurity continues to rise and rise and rise. And just as with conflict itself, this food insecurity is proven to have gendered impacts, with women often eating last and eating least. In 2018, a clear understanding of the causal effect of conflict on the four famines brought the Security Council together to act. The unanimous adoption of Resolution 2417 was truly a watershed moment, a landmark recognition of the impact of conflict on global hunger. Colleagues, today we're convening in the shadow of another conflict-induced food security crisis, one unforeseen just 8 weeks ago. The Russian Federation's illegal, unjustified invasion of Ukraine has caused immeasurable suffering in Ukraine. It has also led to a dramatic surge in food, fertilizer, and energy prices. The impact of Russia's actions extend far beyond Ukraine's sovereign borders. Indeed, it reverberates across the globe. 47 million additional people may experience acute hunger in 2022 as a result of Russia's aggression. We know that both Ukraine and Russia are critical to global food systems. What we're witnessing now is a major disruption to harvest, planting, and supply chains for essential foods and materials. What we're witnessing now is the direct and indirect acceleration of hunger for tens of millions of people, collateral damage of an unwarranted, unwanted war. Colleagues, how many lives will be lost before we in this House wake up to the terrible, costly impact of conflict and hunger? Our responsibility, collectively and individually, is simple. It's clearly set out in Resolution 2417. What's needed now as ever is for all of us to get on with it and do our job, to prevent conflict before it begins, to end conflict before the conflict results in hunger, and to hold to account those who use hunger as a weapon of war. In closing, our hope is that today's meeting will go some way to reinvigorating our collective will to break the vicious cycle between conflict and hunger. We hope we might leave here today with the clear-eyed, determined view that we should prevent further suffering.